So, this is going to be a detailed discussion on the syllabus of ethics. Now, before I even start the discussion, what I want to talk to you about is what happened in 2013. UPSC introduced ethics as a subject. अब उस टाइम पे people found it very obscure. वो तो आज भी लगता है लोगों को कि ये एक ऐसा सब्जेक्ट है जो ना हमने स्कूल के टाइम पढ़ा होता है ना ग्रेजुएशन के टाइम. Most of my students as well as the other aspirants that I've spoken to, they have never come across this subject itself before their preparation. So it becomes very important for you to understand what is UPSC demanding itself. And that's what this video is going to be about. Now, the very first paragraph that UPSC writes when they write the syllabus for ethics gives you exactly what UPSC is demanding from you. They're demanding three things. Let's find out what those three things are. They say that this paper will include questions to test candidates' aptitude and approach to issues relating to integrity, property in public life, and his problem-solving approach to various issues, and the questions may utilize the case study approach. Three things, very categorically pointed out by UPSC. The very first thing is a candidate's approach. 12 lakh people signing up for this examination, 6 lakh appearing for the examination, 10,000 giving mains, and finally 800 getting selected. Each and every single person will have a different approach. When someone says that you have to develop a unique approach, यहाँ पे वो obscurity नहीं चाहिए, आपको norm से बाहर नहीं जाना है. Every single person will have a different approach because that's how your life has been. Your life leading up to this point, everything that you've learned is your own personal approach, and that is what UPSC is trying to say. A candidate's approach, right? The second thing that they're trying to see is what is your moral standing? What is your ethical standing? What happens when there is a crisis? What sort of a decision do you make? आपका good or bad कहाँ lie करता है? Where does your morally good and bad side lie? What do you consider to be good or evil? Right? And how are they doing this? They are trying to do this by simulating case studies. So they are putting you in scenarios where you are supposed to see yourself as a civil servant, a person who is already in a position of power, and then trying to see what sort of an approach do you have towards handling a moral crisis. So usi paragraph mein UPSC has made sure that you understand these three things. It is going to be a unique approach towards solving a moral crisis, right? Now let's look into the syllabus itself in details. So the first point talks about ethics in human interface. It says essence, determinants, and consequences of ethics in human action. Dimensions of ethics, ethics in private and public relationships, human values. How are these human values formed through family, society, education? And then how are you affected by the thoughts of great leaders, administrators, reformers? Now, that is what the syllabus says. But if you go ahead and look at the questions that have come from 2013 to 2021, you would see that the type of questions that are asking are not complete derivatives of this. UPSC आपको पूछने की इस in words में, in words of these syllabus, what they are trying to ask you is particularly the ethics and human interface section. They're trying to ask you, what do you understand by morality? What do you understand by something being good or bad? How do you decide between good and bad? What are the consequences of this decision? Does the consequences matter? You deciding what is good or bad, does it come from your own personal values? Does it matter to you if your values are not culturally sensitive? Are your values universal in nature? Are they constant? Do they change? This is what UPSC is trying to ask you. They're trying to ask you कि आपका जो values आपने develop किए हैं, उसका moral raw material कहाँ से आया है? Have you read certain great thinkers? Are you affected by certain ideology? By a great reformer? By a great administrator? And I know between you and me, most of my students as well as you aspirants who are watching this video, most of you might not have read a lot of ethical thinkers or philosophers. या फिर आपने दो चार पढ़ी होंगी, which is not really, I would say, enough for you to develop a moral standing if you look at it when they talk about great leaders and reformers. But understand this part, that throughout your life, there has always been someone who's told you what is right to do and wrong to do. बचपन से ही आपको बोला जाता है झूठ मत बोलो, don't steal, don't hurt someone, be humble, be honest. So from the very beginning, someone is trying to develop your moral scale. That someone could be family, your teachers, your society, or people that you learn from. In fact, TV, series, movies, all these places affect how you think. And that is what UPSC is trying to learn from you when they talk about ethics and human interface. This is the understanding that you have to develop, right? Then we move on to attitude, aptitude, and emotional intelligence. The first part is about attitude. Now, yes, attitude has its own static portion to it, which is what is attitude, what is the contents of attitude, what is affected by attitude, how is attitude influencing your behavior, does your thought depend on your attitude, how does personality affect your attitude, how do you develop moral and political attitudes, and what is the social influence, and how does social influence change your attitude, and how you can be persuaded or how you can persuade someone, right? But if you look at the questions, the main questions that come out from all the previous year questions, as well as what is UPSC trying to ask here by asking you about attitude, is do you have an attitude to become a civil servant, right? How can you judge yourself? Do you have the capacity to self-evaluate, to self-audit yourself? Do you believe that the attitude that you carry towards the civil services can be without any errors, can be without any undue influence? Is your attitude for civil services being affected by your emotion, by your culture, by people around you? Right? These are the type of questions that the portion of attitude will ask you. Remember, this comes from a position of power. UPSC is already asking you to imagine yourself as a civil servant, as someone who is already in the services. And as we know, with great power comes great responsibility, right? So this is what it is. UPSC is asking you if you can handle that responsibility, if you have the correct attitude towards handling that responsibility. Now the next portion is aptitude and foundational values of civil services. Very quickly, we know that aptitude, when they talk about aptitude, they are trying to see if you can judge yourself if you're fit for the services or not. But again, if you look at the type of questions and the type of questions UPSC has asked before, as well as the moral meaning of this, what they're trying to judge is, do you understand, or are you in a position to evaluate if you should be a civil servant or not? Do you understand what are the foundational values of a civil servant? The whole idea about integrity, probity, non-partisanship. Or do you have these? Do you have the capacity of evaluating yourself on this? Because remember, tomorrow when you create a situation where you have to choose between passion and passivity, are you in a position to evaluate that? See, most of you aspirants that I've spoken to and most of the students that I've spoken to, you have this innate enthusiasm towards the services, which is, I'm going to do amazing for the country. मैं देश के लिए करूँगा, मुझे ये देश के लिए सर्विस करनी है. अब कल जब एक ऐसी सिचुएशन आती है जहाँ पे आपको चूज करना है बिटवीन वेलबींग ऑफ यू वर्सेस डूइंग देश के लिए बहुत कुछ करूँगा, are you able to make that decision? Are you able to put yourself in a position where you can choose passion over your passivity? You can choose your passion over your inaction. That is what aptitude and understanding the foundational values of civil services wants. Right? Because see, again, it talks about tolerance and compassion towards weaker section, which means that you are standing in a position of power. Do you have the capacity to understand, to feel the pain that these people have? And that is this. We come to the next part, which is emotional intelligence, which is feeling that pain, understanding that pain, right? Emotional intelligence talks about the concept of emotional intelligence and how it helps in administration and governance. But from our understanding and from the questions that are asked, we see that what the UPSC is trying to ask you. And see, every time I say what UPSC is trying to ask you, I'm not just considering the examination itself. I'm considering the interview that is going to be conducted. Because remember, again, the same thing happens in the interview. The interviewer is trying to judge where is your moral compass. Where do you stand? Are you fit for the services or not? This written exam is doing it in a written form to see if you know if you're fit for the examination or not. Interviewer is doing that from their perspective. And finally, when you join the services for which you're giving this examination itself, you get judged by the whole society. And you get judged by yourself. So that is what I mean when I'm trying to say that UPSC is trying to ask and trying to understand. So when UPSC is asking you about emotional intelligence, it's trying to ask you if you understand what empathy means. If you can wear the shoes of the people who are in a position under you, who are in a position of help, who need help, a weaker section, or a person who's suffered, you have to understand the pain before you give a solution to the problem itself, right? And that is what emotional intelligence talks about. And then it also talks about emotional intelligence and governance. What is an emotionally sensitive governance? How do you ensure that the decision that you take are empathetic, does emotional intelligence help you make decisions more ethical? So, does it help you make decisions where your judgment of good and bad is better if you didn't have emotional intelligence? Can emotional intelligence be inculcated? If you don't have emotional intelligence, can you learn it? If someone doesn't have it, can they learn it? So these are the type of questions that we're going to tackle when it comes under emotional intelligence. Then we talk about contribution of moral thinkers, philosophers from India and the world. अब यही चीज़ जो हमने ह्यूमन इंटरफेस एंड एथिक्स एंड ह्यूमन इंटरफेस में बात करी, उसी का थोड़ा expanded version होगा ये. But the whole idea is to understand why. Why is UPSC asking you this? UPSC is not asking you to do a PhD on every single thought every single thinker has had. Thinkers are endless. There are old thinkers, new thinkers, contemporary thinkers. And when they talk about India and the world, they are basically covering every single thinker, right? So, are you going to sit here and understand every thinker's thought and try to judge yourself? No. You have to understand the relevance of the thought that these thinkers have had, to understand where the sort of thought experiments they conducted to reach a particular decision, and then see how you align with these thought processes. To see how you align, what do you understand? Because remember, like I said before, these thinkers and philosophers are your moral raw materials. They help you develop your own moral compass. Through thought experiments, through different analogies, you reach a situation where you can make a decision in crisis. That's where these moral thinkers and philosophers help. And isme, yes, the whole idea here is going to be the UPSC is never going to ask you certain thoughts or thinkers. They'll ask you to judge a particular situation based on a particular thinker, or will ask you what or who or which thinker has influenced you in your decision making, right? So that's why we the whole idea behind the thinkers and philosophers part is not to understand the thinkers, but to think. Thinking करनी है, thinkers की चीजें नहीं पढ़नी है, खुद की thinking develop करनी है. That's the whole idea behind contribution of moral thinkers and philosophers. Then we come to two other portions. Now, these two portions of public administration, ethics and public administration, property and governance, are the two portions from where most of the questions come from. Because these two portions draw heavily from all the other portions that we've seen. So the first part is about public civil service values and ethics in public administration. It talks about status, problems, ethical concerns, dilemmas in government, private institutions, and then it also talks about laws, rules, regulations, conscience as a source of ethical guidance. अब इसमें एक तो we have to understand what does it mean to be a part of the public administration. What does public administration itself means? What does it mean to have a conflict between your own personal values and public values? How do you decide between a conflict when there's a conflict between a personal and a professional value, right? And then trying to understand, based on all these thinkers and the ethical thinkers that you've read about and the position that you've created for yourself, how do you make that decision in a crisis, right? Then there are these two words that are mentioned here. The first word is conscience. The second word is accountability. Conscience as a source of ethical guidance, and accountability and ethical governance. Conscience, voice of conscience, अंतरात्मा की आवाज, क्या होती है? How do you develop a conscience? What happens when there is a crisis in conscience? How do you walk the path of conscience? Right? The whole idea is not to give a definition of conscience. It's about developing a conscience. It's about sticking to that conscience when there's a question in case study being asked by you, when there's a question being asked by the interview to you, and when you go into the services and there's a big question mark on your conscience when you have to make a very difficult decision, right? And then accountability. See, accountability in itself is a very big moral term. Are you able to be self accountable? क्या आप अपने आप को सेल्फ इवेल्युएट कर पा रहे हो, अपने आप को सेल्फ ऑडिट कर पा रहे हो बेस्ड ऑन द डिसीजंस दैट यू आर गोइंग टू मेक? अभी रशिया में वॉर चल रहा है. अब all the people who are fighting for Russia, they are having to commit certain crimes, and then tomorrow when they are brought to the court of law, they'll say that we shouldn't be held accountable because we were following the orders. The same situation might happen with you, where a certain superior or from someone who's much above you is directing you to do something which is against your own conscience, against your own moral compass, against your own moral scale. Then how do you decide what you're going to do? Do you hold yourself accountable to it? Or do you say that I have been ordered by the higher authority to do this? The same thing happened in Jallianwala Bagh. People were asked to shoot. People were following orders. They shot. Right? Same thing happened with Nazi Germany. People were following the orders of Hitler, and when they were being held accountable in the court of law, they said that what do we do? If we didn't do this, Hitler would have ordered to kill us. So obedience to authority versus accountability. How do we judge between that? How morally strong are you in your stand that you wouldn't move? Right? No matter what happens, you wouldn't change your stand. That is accountability. And that is what UPSC is trying to ask you, because see, at the end of the day, we've seen different stories come out about different corruptions and different civil servants being involved in different cases. We've seen that. In fact, this is something that you'll read about in case studies, and this is something we both will tackle when it comes to accountability. But the whole idea is to see if you have that moral standing to stand your ground when you know you don't want to do something wrong. Okay? And then finally, it talks about international relations, funding and corporate governance. अब यहाँ पे जो international relation का questions आएंगे, they are going to be very different. They might sound the same, but they are supposed to be answered very differently versus the paper 2. The international relations here, when they talk about power, they talk about accountability, the answers should be given from a moral standpoint, not a logical standpoint, not what has been happening or what should happen, but what do you think should happen? What do you think is right? So again, it's your moral understanding of this. And then comes property in governance. A property in governance talks about concept of public service. Same thing that we spoke about in aptitude, about foundational values. But here, the difference is that UPSC is going to ask you, what do you think are the principal attributes of civil services? You want to join the civil service. You have certain idea about the civil service. Then what do you think is the most important attributes or most important principles to civil services or the public services? It's going to ask you the philosophical basis of governance and property. Property क्या होते हैं? It's your own moral standing. You being completely honest, you being completely morally responsible for what you're going to do. But for that, you have to understand where your stand is. You have to understand कि आप कहाँ lie करते हो यहाँ पे, right? Till what point do you give and till what point do you don't? And then it talks about information sharing, transparency, and usi mein it has also utilized, it talks about utilization funds and corruption. So you would see that transparency, funding and corruption are all related. If a government is not transparent, then the equitable distribution of funds won't happen. If equitable distribution of funds won't happen, then obviously there is a prevalence of corruption happening. So how do you stop it? What does your stand on corruption be? And see, यहाँ पे they're not going to ask you if corruption good and bad, because you and I both know the answer to that. What UPSC is going to ask you is, what do you do in a situation like that, where let's say it's a question between you preventing corruption versus something happening to you. Where does that moral stand come from? Where do you lie when it comes to that? Same thing happens with quality of service delivery. अब अगर आप किसी के घर पे जाते हो, कोई आपको पानी देते हैं, कोई आपको पानी और मिठाई देते हैं, कोई आपका लंच करवाते हैं, उसी तरह आप जब पब्लिक सर्विस में ज्वाइन करेंगे, हाउ यू आर गोइंग टू डिलीवर अ सर्विस डिपेंड्स ऑन यू. देयर इज नो सेट क्राइटेरिया, देयर इज नो सेट रूल्स अंडर हाउ अ सर्विस इज टू बी डिलीवर्ड. सो द क्वालिटी ऑफ डिलीवरी ऑफ सर्विस डिपेंड्स ऑन व्हाट सॉर्ट ऑफ पर्सन यू आर. Because remember, from a position of power, you should be held accountable to your own self. You should do your own self audit, and based on that, you decide what sort of a service delivery you're going to give. Right? And then there is obviously code of ethics, code of conduct, citizen charter. Ye sari cheezein, they are a little more factual, a little more static and factual in nature. But again, the whole idea of developing a code of ethics or a code of conduct is to make sure that people align to it for a better service delivery. And that is something that we'll see in the classes ahead. Now, all the things that we read about, that we just discussed about the whole syllabus, is how the understanding of the syllabus is supposed to be. These are not some deadbeat terms जिसके हमने जाके definitions पढ़ लिए, जाके questions में definition लिख के आ गए. It's about understanding what does it mean for you. It's a very practical subject. Ethics is probably the most practical subject out of all the subjects that you read, because there's an instant understanding and applicability of the subject itself. And that applicability here comes on the second half of the paper, which talks about case studies on all the above issues. So if you have understood where do you stand, you will easily breeze through all these case studies. वरना आप क्या करोगे, आप जाके डिफरेंट वीडियोस देखोगे, वहाँ पे थोड़े हैक्स देखोगे, वहाँ पे देखोगे इस टाइप की केस स्टडी में कैसे आंसर देने होते हैं, उस टाइप की केस स्टडी में कैसे आंसर देने होते हैं. नहीं, you have to develop your own understanding. That's what we've been talking about. Because remember, in the very first few lines of the syllabus, UPSC said three things: a candidate's approach, their own unique approach, their approach towards any ethical or moral crisis, and how do they do it? Through case studies. Right? So this is our discussion on the syllabus of ethics. It requires a certain bit of understanding. The whole subject requires a certain bit of a personal touch. And that personal touch comes from more of reading and thinking and evaluating all these subtopics that ethics has given you. So I hope that you're going to join me in the next episode, where the next video where we talk about the previous year question papers. Previous year question papers ke baad, I'm also going to lay out the course plan for the whole ethics course. The ethics classes will start from next week. We'll start the whole classes from the very beginning. We'll tackle through the whole syllabus and also do case studies. Now, after developing this understanding, I want you to go back and read the syllabus again. And make sure you make pointers. See, these videos from now on, all these videos are going to be I don't want them to be passive videos. I want you to be an active participant in these videos, because I'm not going to give you dictations. What I want you to do is make your own notes, develop your own understanding, because again, this whole paper is about that understanding, right? And go ahead and make sure that you personalize the subject yourself. So I hope you liked the video, and also there are students that you would know that who are going to give the mains examination this year. Share this video with them. This will help them at least understand the subject a little better, which is 50% of the examination itself. So all the best to you guys, and I hope to see you in the next class where we discuss about the previous year question papers.